All right. Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your year ahead horoscope forecast for the sign of Aries for the entire year ahead of 2023. So I'm doing this as a live stream today as a bit of an experiment. So let's see how it goes. So my horoscopes are meant to be read from your rising sign primarily if you have Aries rising, although you can also look at them from the perspective of your sun sign if your sun is in Aries, especially if you were born during the day, or your moon sign, especially if you were born during the night. So let's go ahead and jump right into it then, Aries. So here's a planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and where they'll end up by the end of the year. And here's a list of the primary transits that I want to talk about for your astrological forecast for the entire year of 2023. So the first one I want to start with is Mars is finishing its long retrograde period in Gemini in your third house of siblings, communication, neighbors, and short distance travel during the course of the first 3 months of 2023. So most of this transit already took place in the later part of 2022, where we just passed the middle point actually very recently. But Mars isn't actually going to station direct until January 12th, and it's not going to leave the sign of Gemini that it's transiting in your chart until later in March. So Mars transits typically can indicate periods of conflict or difficulties or setbacks or sometimes even discord in the area of life that they transit. So for you, this could involve like getting in a fight or a falling out with siblings or neighbors. It can indicate being more prone to having combative communication or verbal arguments since it's your third house. It can also indicate some difficulties or interruptions in a short distance trip, like having issues with like a car or getting into some sort of accident or something like that. So it doesn't always have to be the worst case scenario, but the main piece of advice for the first 3 months of the year is just to be extra cautious and careful because sometimes Mars transits can make us a little bit impulsive. And when we do things or say things impulsively, sometimes we can get ourselves into trouble by acting first before we think or getting into a period of being more hot-headed than normal, and that can sometimes put us in difficult or even dangerous situations. So that's one of the first transits that I wanted to mention in the very first part of the year that lasts until March 25th. The next transit that's really notable is that Saturn is finally going to depart from the sign of Aquarius. It's moving out of a long 3-year transit through your 11th house of friends and groups and alliances, which could have indicated a period of contraction and running into surmountable difficulties with friends and groups, or having to restructure your social life in some way, with Saturn transiting through your third house since about March of 2020, give or take. And now Saturn's going to be moving into your 12th house, and the 12th house has to do traditionally in ancient astrology with themes of enemies, sometimes health issues such as either physical health issues like long-term health issues or sometimes dealing with mental health things. And other times it can just have to do with themes having to do with seclusion or finding yourself needing to embrace themes of solitude. So Saturn transits can be a period of contraction and sometimes can indicate surmountable difficulties. So sometimes there can be an issue that arises in this area that forces you to deal with it, but it's one of those cliche sort of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger type scenarios, rather than something that just gets completely in your way and knocks you off course. So one of the things I like to talk about when it comes to the 12th house is enemies. And by enemies, I mean sometimes that just simply means people you don't get along with in your life. And with Saturn transits, it's always going to have to do with needing to think about how to address those people and fix those structures in your life without tearing everything down. So what do you do when you run into a disagreement with somebody, or what do you do when you run up against something in your life where this person just is out for you for some reason, and you need to figure out a calm and sort of like collected way to deal with that without getting overly depressed or walking away from the situation or what have you. So that's going to be one of your themes that's going to come up over the course of the next 3 years, because Saturn's going to be transiting through that sector of your chart until early 2026. This is also a good time to pay attention to health issues as well as long-term mental things, in order to just make sure you're doing the best job taking care of yourself, and that you're doing good diet and exercise and even mental health regimes, in order to make sure you're not letting things go and letting things get to the point where you have some sort of issue come up just because you're not doing what you sort of already know that you're supposed to be doing. So if there's any way that you can be more proactive about dealing with physical and mental health over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, I think that would be constructive, because then you'll come out the other side of this transit in much better shape than you did going into it, because you've kind of confronted and dealt with some of the issues that maybe you'd let go for a period of time. Additionally, with Saturn going through your 12th house, you may just find yourself a little bit less social, especially with Saturn departing from your 11th and the emphasis going from the 11th to the 12th. But sometimes that can be okay to sort of embrace some of those feelings of isolation or solitude in some instances, and find some deeper level of happiness or fulfillment even doing that, just going solo or going it alone sometimes. All right, so that transit really begins in March, and it's going to be on for the next 3 years, off and on. It'll be more or less intense at different points depending on how it's hitting your birth chart. The other transit I wanted to mention, so I talked about Saturn departing from your 11th house of friends and groups, but interestingly, what happens right around the same time is that on March 23rd, the planet Pluto dips into Aquarius for the very first time for a few months, and just gives you a little bit of a preview this year of what that very long-term 20-year transit of Pluto through Aquarius and through your 11th house of friends and groups and alliances is going to be like. So with Pluto going through the 11th, Pluto has to do with themes of intensity and taking small things and making them bigger. It also can sometimes have to do with themes of control and power, and sometimes even manipulation. And for you, with that going through your 11th house, this is primarily going to focus on themes related to friends and groups and alliances, as well as potentially broader themes having to do with organizations or social movements. So you may find yourself in a greater position of power over the course of this transit, where suddenly you're in a position of authority and you have to decide what to do with that power. And if put in that position, if you can wield power in a way that's ethical and good, or alternatively, if you can run into issues with that and sometimes receive pushback because you don't wield that power in a very ethical way. It's going to be largely up to you, but that may be part of a long-term learning process for you, because this transit, while it only lasts for a few months this year, that's just the initial preview, the initial dip of Pluto into Aquarius, and then it's going to go back into your 10th house of career for most of the rest of the year. It's going to be a transit that you want to pay attention to, just because it's going to last for so long, into, I believe, the early 2040s. So that's a long-term transit. It's going to hit different people's charts in different ways. So it's not that that transit's going to be intense during the entire period, but as soon as that planet changes signs, it would be good to pay attention to what themes start to arise in your life with respect to friends and groups, just because some of those themes may have much more longer-term importance than you might expect just initially. So definitely pay attention to that. All right, I see we have a bunch of people in the live chat. Thanks everyone for joining me today. I'm actually able to follow this a little bit, and I appreciate all your comments. I may have a little time for question and answer later, but if you have any experiences or events based on past transits that I mention, be sure to let me know in the comments, just because I'm curious how other people with Aries rising have experienced some of these transits, or what they might anticipate coming up in the future based on some of the things that I'm already saying here. All right, so let's go back. So those are some of the heavier transits this year. I want to transition now into some of the more positive transits, because there's actually a lot of good ones this year, especially for those with Aries rising. So the first one I want to focus on and pay attention to is one that's about to begin again here, which is Jupiter is going to ingress into Aries here later in December of 2022, and it's going to be transiting through the sign of Aries for the entire first about 5 months of 2023. So Jupiter is the planet of growth and expansion and possibilities. And going through your rising sign is usually a period of growth and expansion, especially in your a personal sense and your sense of self. So you're going to find yourself being a bit more optimistic this year. You're going to find yourself potentially being a little bit more lucky this year in terms of being in the right place at the right time. Jupiter transits have this sense of just like optimism and growth and possibilities. And I think this year, especially in the first 5 months, you want to pay very close attention to any opportunities for growth, either personal and internal, but also, as we'll see later, there can also be some potential for growth even financially this year as well, because the next transit that's going to take place after Jupiter departs from Aries is that Jupiter is actually going to move into Taurus for the entire second half of the year. And the second house, or Taurus for you, is your second house, which is the place of finances, possessions, and income. So basically, you're going to go from one pretty positive transit that can affect things like your sense of self, body, your character in terms of being more optimistic, as well as your appearance. So that if there's anything about your appearance that you've wanted to change or trying new things that you've wanted to experiment with, this can be a good time for that with Jupiter going through in the first half of the year. We're then going to shift into a period of growth and expansion with respect to money, possessions, and finances in the second half of the year, which basically can just be a good period to attempt to grow financially. If there's new projects that you've been wanting to initiate, this can be a good time to do that business-wise. If you've thought about, it's not usually a period of like consolidation necessarily, because that's more of a Saturn transit type thing in the second house, but basically just finding areas where there's the potential for growth, seeing if you can put sort of water on those areas in terms of like planting new seeds in that area. And this will be a time in the second half of the year where you'll see those things growing much more than previous years. And in some ways, this is going to be a continuation because we've already had a number of eclipses taking place in the sign of Taurus recently, which indicates major beginnings and major endings for you financially, so that you may have already started trying some new things financially over the course of 2022. But here, I think in 2023, you're going to find more success. You're going to see that the seeds that you planted previously are starting to grow in a way that's much more fruitful and a much more just readily accessible for you than in other times, like in 2022. All right, so Jupiter in the second, good financial transit, entire second half of the year. Other really positive transits going on this year. We've got a Venus retrograde in the sign of Leo. So that's going to really take place. It's going to start as soon as Venus ingresses into Leo on June 5th. And that's going to last all the way until Venus departs from Leo on October 8th. But really the greatest period of intensity is when Venus will slow down and station retrograde from July 22nd until it eventually stations direct on September 3rd. So for you with Aries rising, Leo, of course, is your fifth house. And the fifth house traditionally has to do with significations like children, but also things like creativity or that which you create, but also fun, games, pleasure. The fifth house is also the house of sex and romance. So with Venus going retrograde in this house, especially for those of you with night charts, this is going to be a relatively positive period for just having fun, enjoyment, pleasure, and all of those different things. With Venus going retrograde, though, sometimes things can come back from the past that you thought were over or that you, for some reason, need to revisit. So especially since this is your fifth house, this may have to do with romantic things from your past that you have to go back and look at again, because Venus is literally going to slow down and then retrace her steps. And for some reason, or for some people, Venus retrogrades can actually connect events that happen in 8-year increments. So the last time that Venus went retrograde in the same spot in the zodiac in Leo was in the summer of 2015, exactly 8 years earlier. So for some of you, you may be revisiting events that happened during that summer of 2015 and going back, and sometimes this can be reconnecting with people that were important with your life back then. Other times it can be looking back at events that happened back then and finding out that you need to revisit them for some other reason, whether to reconnect with people, or in other instances, it can be like a brief reconnection, but you can still end up deciding that you made the right choice before, if there was a choice to separate or to no longer continue certain relationships. That's going to be, for many of you, like one of the choices that you have over the course of this coming summer. Additionally, it can be a period of important developments when it comes to children. So either if you have children, or if you're thinking about children, or if children are on the table, or even honestly, if we're not planning on having children, you might want to be a little bit careful during that time period, because sometimes having important transits in your fifth house can indicate a period in which the topic of children suddenly becomes more important to you for some reason, which can sometimes actually, for certain people, be an indicator of having children unexpectedly at certain times in life. So that's actually a pretty positive transit, especially for those of you with night charts. The Jupiter transits through the second house of finances are going to be more positive for those of you with day charts. The final set of things that I want to talk about is the eclipses that are taking place this year. So what we're going to see is a shift of the eclipses, first taking place in April and May, where those two eclipses are going to be taking place in the signs of Aries and Scorpio, which is your first house of self and your eighth house of other people's money and shared resources and finances. The eighth house can also have to do with inheritance or other topics surrounding mortality and that general topic in general. So part of this is that we're going to start to see a shift of the eclipses this year, which are going to move out of your second and eighth house axis, where they've been for most of 2020 at this point, or 2022, which is your financial axis. So you've seen and already been through a period of major beginnings and major endings when it comes to topics like finances, personal possessions, debt, inheritance, the assets of other, or even your partner's resources. So some of that you've already seen start, where you've had major beginnings or major endings in that area. And that story is basically going to continue on as we get the last two eclipses in the signs of Scorpio and Taurus during the course of 2023. But it will also start to wrap up and be brought to conclusion. So many of you probably already know what that story is about, because you've already seen some of those major changes take place the last couple of times we had eclipses in Taurus and Scorpio. For example, in October and November of 2022, or earlier in the year in April and May of 2022. So just think to stories of major beginnings and endings when it comes to finances in that sector of your chart. So I have a sense that for many of you with Aries rising, that this is going to be a positive story, or a positive conclusion to that story, since Jupiter's ingressing into Taurus and into your house of finances and resources. So it should be like a good ending to whatever that financial chapter was that's beginning in your life or ending in your life, and then the new chapter that's beginning in terms of finances. But the eclipse axis is shifting now out of your financial sector, and during the course of 2023, it's going to start taking place in Aries and Libra, which is your self versus relationship sector of your chart. So what'll happen at this point is that, especially later in the year, in that second eclipse that's going to take place in the sign of Libra in October, that's when you're going to start getting eclipses in your seventh house of relationships. And usually that means that the person is going to go through a period of major beginnings and major endings when it comes to relationships. So for some of you, if you are single, or if you don't have relationships in your life at this present point in time, you may find yourself actually beginning a major relationship at this time when those eclipses start taking place in that sector of your chart. For others, it can be a period where relationships either come to an end if they're not meant to last, or it can be a period where you reach a turning point or the end of a chapter in a current relationship, so that you've sort of gone as far as you can go, but something needs to change at this point when it comes to relationships in your life. Eclipses, as we've seen, especially in October and November, can have this kind of disruptive energy where everything is sort of thrown up in the air and becomes very chaotic. So that's one of the things that can sometimes happen, or you can sometimes feel when it comes to eclipses. But ultimately, I think these changes are typically for the best because it's pushing you in a direction sometimes that you might not have gone otherwise, or that you might have been reluctant to go, even though it's probably the better direction for you to go ultimately, or the direction that you're supposed to head. So with the eclipses, though, bouncing back and forth between your 7th house of relationships and your 1st house of self, sometimes you'll find yourself teeter-tottering between those two topics in 6-month increments, basically, starting in 2023 and that carrying forward into 2024, where we see the rest of that eclipse series, where sometimes you're going to be putting more focus on relationships, maybe too much focus on relationships so that you start neglecting your own needs for yourself, versus other times you're going to start putting more focus on yourself and what you want in life, and you might start neglecting your relationships to a certain extent, which then will create an imbalance there. So it starts going back and forth in these 6 months increments. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just a process that'll be happening over the course of about a year and a half or two as the eclipses are taking place in that sign. And by the end of it, by the time we come out of that eclipse series at some point in 2024, 2025, you'll just see yourself emerge with a much better grasp on who you are, what you want in life, and what your sense of self-identity is, as well as what you want out of relationships and what types of relationships you want to attract in your life or cultivate at this point in time, and how that might be different compared to, let's say, earlier in your life, let's say 5 or 10 years earlier. So that, I believe, is actually the last major transit that I wanted to mention for you, was those eclipses, which will take place again April and May, and then in October. There's a large concentration of eclipses at that point. All right, so those are the major themes that I wanted to cover in this year ahead forecast for the rising sign of Aries for 2023. I'm just taking a look at the chat. Thanks everyone for joining me today for this live stream. I appreciate it. It's cool seeing everybody join me to record this live. If you have any comments or observations, please be sure to leave them in the comments box, either in the live chat or below this video, especially if you have any experiences that you'd like to share in terms of transits that have come up for you recently in the past in some of these sectors of your chart, like Saturn transiting through Aquarius in your 11th house of friends, or how some of the Jupiter transits have been treating you, or other things like that. I'm genuinely interested, because then we can learn more about how some of these transits work, which, once we compile that together, can help us improve our predictions going forward. All right, so I think that's it for this forecast. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out the year ahead forecast that we're going to record next week on December 16th, where we're going to talk about sort of a big picture view of the astrology of 2023 in more detail. So until then, that's it for this horoscope. So I'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code Astrology Podcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. I also recently published a new translation of the anthology of the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens, which is one of the most important sources for understanding the practice of ancient astrology. You can find that by searching for Vedius Valens, the anthology on Amazon or other online book retailers. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. I also recently launched a new course there called the Birth Time Rectification course, where I teach students how to figure out your birth time using astrology when the birth time is either unknown or uncertain. You can find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Each year, the podcast releases a set of astrology calendar posters for the coming year, and we've just released our 2023 planetary alignments and planetary movements posters, which are now available on our website at theastrologypodcast.com/store. There you can also pick up our 2023 electional astrology report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through the next 12 months and we picked out the single most auspicious date for each month using the principles of electional astrology. You can get that at theastrologypodcast.com/2023 report. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com. Finally, thanks also to the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening May 25th through the 29th, 2023, just outside of Seattle. This year's conference is going to be a hybrid conference where you can either attend online or in person. Find out more information at norwac.net.